At the very bottom of Illinois, where the Ohio River meets the Mississippi, there is a town of fewer than 1,800 people called Cairo. It is pronounced Cairo, not like the Egyptian capital, though the name was chosen deliberately and with the full weight of 19th-century American ambition behind it. The founders of Cairo looked at a map in the 1830s and saw what seemed like a geographic certainty. Two of the mightiest rivers on the North American continent converged at this single point, forming a natural junction that would control river commerce from Pittsburgh to New Orleans, from St. Louis to Memphis, from Cincinnati to the Gulf of Mexico. Every flatboat, every steamboat, every barge carrying cotton or grain or lumber or iron would pass through this confluence. Whoever built a city here would sit at the toll gate of the American interior. The comparison to Egypt was not modesty. The founders genuinely believed that Cairo, Illinois, would become the greatest inland city in the Western Hemisphere, the point where all of America's commercial arteries met, the capital of a river empire that would dwarf anything on the eastern seaboard. Charles Dickens visited in 1842, took one look at the muddy, fever-ridden settlement, and described it in American Notes as a place of desolation and decay so thorough that the very trees seemed to be rotting where they stood. Mark Twain set a portion of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn at Cairo's riverbanks, because even in fiction, the confluence was the pivot point where the story's direction changed. Abraham Lincoln tried a legal case there in 1858 and found a boomtown that was betting its entire future on the proposition that geography was destiny. Geography, it turned out, was not enough. This is the story of the city that was supposed to be bigger than Chicago and how it became one of the most complete ghost towns in America. The land that would become Cairo was first surveyed in 1818, the same year Illinois achieved statehood. The site's potential was immediately obvious to anyone who understood river commerce, which in the early 19th century meant anyone who understood American commerce at all. Before railroads, before highways, before the telegraph, rivers were the only efficient means of moving goods across distances greater than a few miles. The Mississippi and Ohio rivers together drained a basin covering nearly half the continental United States. Their junction point was, in the most literal sense, the center of American trade. The first serious attempt to develop Cairo came in 1837, when the Cairo City and Canal Company was chartered by the Illinois state legislature with the backing of Eastern investors who saw the confluence as a speculative gold mine. The company's plan was ambitious: build a levee system to protect the low-lying land from flooding, construct a canal connecting the two rivers across the narrow peninsula, and sell lots to merchants, warehouse operators, and anyone else who wanted to profit from the inevitable commerce that would flow through the junction. The plan failed almost immediately. The Panic of 1837 wiped out the investors. The levees, inadequately engineered, were breached by the first major flood. The canal was never built. The few settlers who had arrived found themselves living on a mudflat that was underwater for months at a time, surrounded by mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever with democratic efficiency. By 1840, Cairo's population was negligible, and the Eastern press had begun referring to the venture as one of the great land swindles of the decade. But the geography did not change. The rivers still met at the same point, and the logic that had drawn the first investors remained sound even after their money was gone. In the 1850s, a second wave of development began, driven this time by the Illinois Central Railroad, which chose Cairo as its southern terminus. The railroad's arrival changed the calculation entirely. Cairo was no longer just a river junction. It was now the point where river commerce and rail commerce intersected, a multimodal transportation hub of the kind that would define American cities for the next half-century. The Illinois Central connected Cairo to Chicago, 365 miles to the north. Steamboats connected Cairo to every port on the Mississippi and Ohio rivers. A merchant in Cairo could ship goods to New Orleans by river and to New York by rail, or receive goods from both directions simultaneously. By 1860, Cairo had approximately 2,200 residents and was growing faster, in percentage terms, than almost any town in the state. Then the Civil War came, and Cairo discovered what it was actually good for. The secession crisis of 1860 to 1861 transformed Cairo overnight from a speculative investment into a strategic necessity. Look at a map and the reason becomes obvious. Cairo sits at the junction of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, which together formed the dividing line between the Union and the Confederacy in the Western Theater. Missouri, across the Mississippi to the west, was a border state whose loyalty was contested. Kentucky, across the Ohio to the east, was attempting an impossible neutrality. Tennessee, downstream on the Mississippi, was Confederate. Whoever held Cairo held the key to the entire river system. If the Confederacy seized it, Union forces would lose access to the Mississippi and Ohio rivers simultaneously, and the war in the West would become immeasurably more difficult. If the Union held it, every Confederate position along both rivers would be vulnerable to attack from upstream. In September 1861, Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant arrived in Cairo to take command of the District of Southeast Missouri. Grant established his headquarters in the town and used it as the base for the campaigns that would capture Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in February 1862, opening the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers to Union forces and beginning the slow strangulation of the Confederacy's western flank. Cairo was fortified, garrisoned, and transformed into a military logistics center of the First Order. Troops, supplies, ammunition, horses, and hospital equipment flowed through Cairo in quantities that tested the capacity of both the railroad and the river fleet. The town's population swelled with soldiers, contractors, camp followers, and the thousands of formerly enslaved people who fled to Union lines seeking freedom and found, in Cairo, something that resembled it more closely than anything they had known. The war years established Cairo's reputation and its infrastructure simultaneously. The town acquired a hospital complex, a quartermaster depot, a network of wharves capable of servicing dozens of vessels simultaneously, and a telegraph office that connected it directly to Washington. Contraband camps, settlements of formerly enslaved people who had crossed Union lines, grew up on the edges of town, and the residents of those camps would form the nucleus of Cairo's post-war black community. By 1865, Cairo had wharves, warehouses, hotels, a commercial district, and a population that had grown accustomed to the extraordinary volume of commerce that a major military operation generates. The question after the war was whether that volume could be sustained in peacetime. For roughly 2 decades, the answer appeared to be yes. Cairo's population grew steadily through the 1870s and 1880s, fueled by the river trade, the railroad connection, and the general westward expansion of the American economy. Lumber from the forests of Wisconsin and Minnesota floated down the Mississippi and was processed in Cairo's sawmills. Cotton from the plantations of the Deep South came upriver to be transshipped to northern textile factories via the Illinois Central. Grain, livestock, manufactured goods, and passengers all passed through the confluence in volumes that justified the investment in wharves, warehouses, and rail yards. By 1890, the population had reached approximately 9,000, and by 1920, it had peaked at roughly 15,000, a respectable size for a southern Illinois town, though far short of the imperial destiny its founders had imagined. The commercial district expanded along Commercial Avenue, the town's main business street, which ran parallel to the Ohio River levee. Hotels, banks, dry goods stores, grocers, an opera house, and professional offices lined the avenue. The Halliday Hotel, a grand structure that had hosted Grant during the war, was expanded and renovated into one of the finest hotels in downstate Illinois. The Custom House, a federal building of considerable architectural distinction, was erected to process the river commerce that continued to flow through the confluence in significant volume. Cairo in its prime was a small city with large ambitions and the infrastructure to support them. It had 2 newspapers, a public library, a YMCA, churches of every denomination, fraternal lodges, and a social hierarchy that mirrored the larger patterns of American small city life. The white business class controlled the commercial district, the local government, and the social institutions. The black community, which had been established during the Civil War and had grown steadily afterward, occupied a parallel world of churches, schools, businesses, and social organizations that existed within the same geographic boundaries but with sharply limited access to political power and economic opportunity. This dual structure, a white city and a black city sharing the same streets but not the same resources, would become Cairo's defining characteristic and, ultimately, its destruction. The first sign that Cairo's geographic advantage was not permanent came with the railroads themselves. The same technology that had made Cairo a multimodal hub in the 1850s was, by the 1880s, making river commerce increasingly irrelevant. Railroads were faster, more reliable, and not subject to the seasonal variations in water level that could shut down river traffic for weeks at a time. The great river ports, St. Louis, Memphis, Natchez, Vicksburg, all experienced a decline in their river-dependent economies as the railroad network expanded. But those cities had other advantages: established populations, diversified economies, state capital functions, university systems, industrial bases. Cairo had none of these. It had the rivers, and the rivers were becoming less important with every mile of new track laid across the prairie. The population plateau that Cairo reached around 1920, roughly 15,000 residents, was not a pause before further growth. It was a ceiling. The town never grew beyond it. In hindsight, the reasons are clear. Cairo was too far from any major metropolitan center to function as a suburb or satellite city. It was too small to attract industrial employers who needed large labor pools. Its location, at the absolute southern tip of Illinois, placed it culturally and economically closer to the rural Deep South than to the industrial Midwest. The land was low, flat, flood-prone, and expensive to maintain because the levee system required constant upkeep. The climate was hot, humid, and oppressive in summer, with mosquitoes that made outdoor life miserable from May through September. None of these factors had mattered when the rivers were king. All of them mattered when the rivers stopped being king. The slow economic decline might have continued for decades without producing catastrophe. Plenty of small American river towns lost their commercial relevance in the early 20th century and settled into quiet existence as county seats, retirement communities, or agricultural service centers. Cairo could have done the same. It had the county courthouse. It had the hospital. It had a location that, while no longer commercially strategic, was at least scenic. The Confluence itself is a genuinely dramatic landscape. Two enormous rivers meeting and merging in a slow-motion collision of muddy water that stretches for miles. But Cairo did not settle into quiet existence. It tore itself apart. The racial violence that defined Cairo's 20th century did not begin in the 1960s. It began decades earlier, with incidents that established a pattern of white terrorism against the black community that would repeat, with variations, for over a century. In 1909, a black man named William James was lynched by a white mob in Cairo. His body was hanged from a steel arch on Commercial Avenue, the town's main business street, and left there as a public spectacle. The governor of Illinois sent the state militia to restore order, but no one was prosecuted for the killing. The message was clear. Violence against black residents would be tolerated by the white power structure, and the consequences for perpetrators would be non-existent. The lynching of William James was not an isolated event. It was the most visible manifestation of a racial power structure that operated through routine intimidation, economic exclusion, and the threat of violence that did not need to be carried out often to be effective. Black residents of Cairo lived within boundaries, geographic, economic, and social, that were enforced by custom and occasionally by force. They could work in certain jobs but not others. They could live on certain streets but not others. They could patronize certain businesses but were unwelcome in many. The public facilities, parks, swimming pools, restaurants, theaters were segregated by law until the mid-1960s and by practice for years afterward. This was not unusual for a border state town in the early 20th century. What was unusual was the intensity of the enforcement and the willingness of the white community to resort to collective violence when the boundaries were challenged. In the decades that followed the James lynching, Cairo's racial climate remained toxic but contained, held in an unstable equilibrium by the same economic interdependence that characterized most small southern and border state towns. White businesses depended on black customers. Black workers depended on white employers. Neither community could afford to destroy the other without destroying itself. But the equilibrium was fragile, and when the civil rights movement reached Cairo in the late 1960s, it shattered completely. The crisis began in 1967, when a black soldier named Robert Hunt was found dead in the Cairo city jail. The official ruling was suicide. The black community did not believe it. Protests erupted, and the white response was immediate and organized. A group called the White Hats, white vigilantes who wore white construction helmets as identification, began patrolling the streets of Cairo, armed and explicit about their intention to suppress black protest by force. The black community formed its own organization, the United Front of Cairo, led by Reverend Charles Cohen, and organized a comprehensive boycott of white-owned businesses. What followed was not a riot, it was something worse, a slow-motion siege that lasted years. The boycott was devastatingly effective. Black residents, who constituted roughly 40% of Cairo's population and a proportional share of its consumer spending, simply stopped patronizing white-owned stores on Commercial Avenue. They drove to other towns, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, Paducah, Kentucky, Carbondale, Illinois, to buy their groceries, their clothing, their hardware. The economic impact was immediate and severe. White merchants who had depended on black customers for decades watched their revenue collapse. Some closed. Others held on, sustained by loans and stubbornness and the hope that the boycott would end. It did not end. The boycott went on for years. Some historians date its effective duration to nearly a decade, sustained by a community anger that had been accumulating for generations, and that the death of Robert Hunt had merely detonated. The United Front maintained discipline through weekly mass meetings at the Ward Chapel AME Church, where Reverend Cohn and other leaders reinforced the boycott's rationale and addressed the inevitable pressures, economic hardship, fatigue, fear that threatened to weaken it. The organization published lists of targeted businesses, organized carpools to out-of-town stores, and maintained a communication network that ensured compliance was both voluntary and socially expected. The White Hats escalated their intimidation. Gunshots were fired into black neighborhoods at night. Firebombs were thrown. The National Guard was deployed to Cairo multiple times between 1969 and 1972. The town became a national symbol of racial conflict, covered by network television news and the major newspapers in a way that was uniformly negative for Cairo's reputation and catastrophic for its already fragile economy. The boycott accomplished what it was designed to accomplish. It forced economic pain on the white business establishment. But it also accelerated a process of mutual destruction that left no winners. White businesses closed because they lost their black customers. Black residents lost the local businesses they had been boycotting, which meant they now had to travel 30 or 40 miles for basic necessities, which meant they were spending their money in other towns permanently. The economic ecosystem of Cairo, small, isolated, and already under pressure from regional economic changes, could not survive the severing of its internal commercial relationships. Both communities bled out together. The white community's response to the boycott was not accommodation, it was retaliation and retreat. White families who had the means to leave began doing so in the early 1970s. They moved across the river to Missouri, north to Carbondale and Marion, anywhere that was not Cairo. White-owned businesses that survived the boycott often chose to relocate rather than continue operating in a town that had become, from their perspective, hostile. The exodus fed on itself. Each departing family reduced the customer base for remaining businesses. Each closing business reduced the reason for remaining families to stay. The white community and the black community, locked in a conflict that neither could win, both lost everything instead. The population numbers track the damage with pitiless precision. In 1960, Cairo had 9,348 residents. By 1970, it was 6,277. By 1980, it was 5,931. By 1990, it was 4,846. By 2000, it was 3,632. By 2010, it was 2,831. By 2020, it was 1,733. The decline has been continuous, relentless, and apparently terminal. Each decade takes another 20 to 30% of the remaining population. The people who leave are disproportionately young because there is nothing in Cairo for a young person to do. No jobs, no entertainment, no educational opportunities beyond the local school district, which has been struggling for decades with declining enrollment and shrinking state funding. The physical landscape of Cairo today is difficult to describe without sounding like you are exaggerating. Commercial Avenue, the main business street where William James was lynched in 1909 and where the White Hats patrolled in 1967, is a row of boarded storefronts extending for several blocks. The buildings are still standing, most of them, their brick facades intact, their display windows covered with plywood that has weathered to gray. A few businesses remain, a convenience store, a gas station, a funeral home. The rest are empty. The Halliday Hotel, the grand structure that once hosted Ulysses Grant and was the social center of Cairo's commercial life, was demolished in the 1940s. The Custom House, the federal building that processed river commerce, still stands but is used only intermittently. The public housing projects that were built in the 1940s and 1950s to provide affordable housing for Cairo's working families, Pyramid Courts and McBride Terrace, were closed, evacuated, and left standing empty. They stand there now, their windows knocked out, their interiors gutted by vandals and scavengers, their parking lots overgrown with weeds. They are among the most disturbing ruins in America, not because they are grand, but because they are ordinary. They are the places where people lived, where children played, where families ate dinner and watched television and went to sleep. And now they are hollow shells that no one will ever inhabit again. There is a detail about Cairo's public housing that is worth pausing on, because it illustrates the completeness of the failure. Pyramid Courts, a 410-unit public housing complex built in 1942 to provide affordable housing for war workers and their families, was one of the largest public housing developments in downstate Illinois. For decades, it functioned as intended, a community of working families, many of them black, who lived in modest but clean apartments and whose children attended the local schools and whose parents worked at the few remaining employers in Alexander County. By the 1990s, as the population decline accelerated and the local economy hollowed out, Pyramid Courts became increasingly isolated, a concentration of poverty in a town that was itself becoming a concentration of poverty. Maintenance declined, crime increased, units were vacated and not refilled. In 2015, the Alexander County Housing Authority closed Pyramid Courts entirely and relocated the remaining residents. The buildings still stand, all 410 units, empty, their windows smashed, their interiors stripped, their parking lots cracked and sprouting vegetation. The Department of Housing and Urban Development demolished some units, but the project was never completed, and the partially demolished complex is somehow more disturbing than either a standing building or a cleared lot would be. It is a structure caught in the act of being erased, frozen mid-demolition, as if the wrecking crew simply ran out of money or motivation and walked away. McBride Terrace, a smaller housing project on the north side of town, followed an identical trajectory: decline, vacancy, closure, abandonment. Together, the two projects represent several hundred units of housing that were built with federal money, occupied by American families for decades, and then abandoned because the town around them could no longer sustain even the minimal economic activity required to justify their existence. The schools tell the same story. Cairo High School, which once fielded football teams and marching bands and sent graduates to college, has seen its enrollment decline to the point where maintaining a full academic program is barely possible. The elementary schools have been consolidated as enrollment dropped. The library is open but understaffed. The churches, and Cairo has churches in numbers disproportionate to its population, because churches are often the last institutions to close in a dying town, still hold services, though their congregations are small and elderly. What makes Cairo's collapse unique among American ghost towns is that it was not caused by the exhaustion of a natural resource, like the mining towns of the West, or by the departure of a single industry, like the steel towns of the Rust Belt. Cairo's resource, its geographic position, is still there. The rivers still meet at the same point. The confluence is as strategically located today as it was in 1837. But strategic location only matters if there is something to be strategic about. The river commerce that was supposed to make Cairo the greatest inland city in America dwindled to irrelevance over a century, replaced first by railroads, and then by highways, and then by the global supply chains that make geographic position within the continental United States far less important than it was when flatboats were the cutting edge of logistics technology. Cairo's founders were not wrong about the value of the confluence. They were wrong about how long that value would last. And then the racial crisis of the late 1960s and early 1970s delivered the blow that a stronger city might have survived, but that Cairo, already weakened by decades of economic irrelevance, could not. The boycott destroyed the commercial ecosystem. The violence destroyed the civic trust. The national media coverage destroyed the reputation. And the population loss that followed destroyed the tax base, which destroyed the public services, which accelerated the population loss, which destroyed more of the tax base, in a spiral that has been turning for 50 years and shows no sign of stopping. There is a particular desolation to walking through Cairo that is different from the desolation of other abandoned American places. In Gary, Indiana, the ruins are grand Gothic churches, Art Deco theaters, limestone commercial palaces. The scale of what was lost is visible in the architecture. In Cairo, the scale is more modest. The buildings are smaller. The streets are narrower. The ambition that built them was not corporate ambition backed by billions of dollars, but small-town ambition backed by geography and hope. The loss feels more intimate. These were not the dreams of a corporation. They were the dreams of individual merchants, individual families, individual preachers who built their churches by hand and watched them fill on Sunday mornings. The dreams were smaller, and watching them die is somehow worse for that. The levees still stand. They have to. Cairo sits on a peninsula between two rivers, and without the levee system, the town would flood every spring. The Army Corps of Engineers maintains the levees as part of its Mississippi River management responsibilities, which means that federal money continues to flow into Cairo for the sole purpose of keeping the water out of a town where almost no one lives anymore. There is something absurd about this, and something poignant. The infrastructure that was supposed to support a city of 100,000 now protects a town of 1,700. And it will continue to protect that town as long as the federal government considers the levee system worth maintaining, which is to say, as long as the bureaucratic momentum of the Army Corps of Engineers continues to carry the project forward, regardless of whether anyone is behind the levees to benefit from the protection. Alexander County, of which Cairo is the county seat, is the poorest county in Illinois and one of the poorest in the United States. The median household income is approximately $25,000. The unemployment rate is chronically above the state average. The county's largest employers are the school district, the county government, and a handful of social service agencies, institutions that exist not to generate wealth, but to distribute what little remains. There is no manufacturing base. There is no significant agricultural economy. The land is too low and too flood-prone for profitable farming at scale. There is no tourism industry, despite the dramatic beauty of the confluence. There is no plan, no strategy, no initiative with realistic funding and realistic goals that offers a credible path from where Cairo is to anywhere significantly better. The ruins of Cairo are not being demolished at any significant rate. The city lacks the resources to tear down its own abandoned buildings, and no outside entity has seen fit to fund the effort. So the buildings stand, slowly deteriorating, their roofs leaking, their walls cracking, their foundations shifting in the soft alluvial soil. The brick facades of Commercial Avenue will last another 50 years, maybe longer. The wooden residential structures will collapse within a decade or two. The concrete public housing blocks could stand for a century if no one touches them. Cairo is not being erased. It is being slowly dissolved by weather and time and the quiet persistence of vegetation that does not care what a building was used for or who used to live inside it. The people who remain in Cairo are not there because they failed to leave. Many of them are there because they chose to stay, and that choice deserves a kind of respect that the narrative of decline rarely affords. The elderly residents who have lived in Cairo for 50 or 60 years remember a different town. A town with stores and schools and Friday night football and church suppers and neighbors who knew each other by name. They remember the noise and activity of a functioning community, and they compare it daily to the silence that has replaced it. Some stay because they own their homes and cannot sell them for enough to relocate. Some stay because their social networks, family, church, friendships built over decades are here and nowhere else. Some stay out of sheer stubbornness, an unwillingness to be the last one to turn out the lights, a refusal to let the town die on their watch, even as it dies around them. There is a woman in Cairo who tends a garden on a vacant lot that used to be a house. She grows tomatoes, peppers, collard greens, and flowers. The lot is surrounded on 3 sides by other vacant lots, and on the 4th by an abandoned house with a caved-in roof. She gardens there every day in season because, she says, somebody has to. The town may be empty, but the soil still works. That may be the most accurate one-sentence summary of Cairo, Illinois that anyone has ever offered. There is one last thing worth saying about Cairo, Illinois, and it is the thing that makes the story impossible to dismiss as simply another tale of a small town that failed. Cairo was supposed to be Chicago. That was not a fantasy cooked up by optimistic real estate agents. It was a reasonable projection based on the geographic and economic realities of early 19th century America. In 1830, when the first serious plans for Cairo were being drawn up, Chicago did not exist. The land that would become Chicago was a marshy portage between the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River, inhabited by a few hundred people living around a military outpost called Fort Dearborn. Cairo's geographic advantages, the confluence of the 2 great rivers, the natural junction of north-south and east-west commerce, were, by any rational assessment, superior to anything Chicago had to offer. What Chicago had, and Cairo did not, was timing, and the particular kind of geography that the next era of transportation would reward. Chicago sat at the portage between the Great Lakes watershed and the Mississippi watershed, a position that was unremarkable in the age of river commerce, but became supremely valuable in the age of the railroad. Railroads needed flat land for their yards, access to multiple directions for their routes, and a hinterland of farmland and industry to generate freight. Chicago had all of these. Cairo had a swamp at the end of a peninsula between 2 rivers, with no room to expand and no hinterland worth mentioning. Chicago became the railroad capital of America. Cairo remained a river town at the precise historical moment when river towns stopped being where the future was built. That single technological shift from water to rail, completed between roughly 1860 and 1890, determined which city would become the 3rd largest in America and which would become a ghost town of 1,700 people with boarded windows and empty streets. The founders of Cairo were not fools. They were rational men making a rational bet on the technology of their time. The technology changed, the bet lost, and the city that was built on the bet has been paying the price ever since. You can drive to the Confluence today. There is a small park at the very tip of the peninsula, Fort Defiance Park, where you can stand on a concrete platform and watch the Ohio River merge with the Mississippi. The Ohio's water is relatively clear. The Mississippi's is brown with sediment. For a stretch of several hundred yards downstream, you can see the 2 rivers flowing side by side without mixing, a visible boundary between 2 bodies of water that will eventually become one. It is a genuinely beautiful and genuinely strange sight, the kind of landscape feature that, in a different context, would anchor a thriving tourist economy. There is no tourist economy in Cairo. The park has a few informational signs and a flagpole. On most days, it is empty. The rivers do not care. The Ohio and the Mississippi meet at the same point today that they met at when the first European explorers mapped the confluence in the 17th century. The water is the same water, flowing from the same mountains and prairies, carrying the same sediment to the same gulf. The junction is still there. It is still, in some abstract geographic sense, the center of something. But the something it is the center of no longer matters to the economy that determines where Americans live and build and prosper. The rivers flow through Cairo the way blood flows through a limb that has lost its nerve connections, continuously, without purpose, without response. If your family came from Cairo or from any of the small river towns of southern Illinois and western Kentucky that shared Cairo's trajectory, if not its extremity, tell me about it in the comments. Tell me what your grandparents said about the town when it still had stores on Commercial Avenue, and families in the housing projects, and football games at the high school on Friday nights. Because those memories are the only record of what Cairo was during the brief window when it was alive, and they are disappearing faster than the buildings. And if this story made you think about the gap between what America promised and what it delivered, about the cities that were drawn on maps before they existed, and then abandoned before they were finished, subscribe to The Buried Record. Because this is what we do here. We look at the places that were supposed to become something, and we ask, what happened instead?